Hi, today we have the privilege to welcome Alice Flaherty to the Conn job. She's an extraordinary neurologist. She works at Mass General and specializes in movement disorders. She has also been educated at MIT. She is one of the unique people, an excellent doctor, and she's has a fabulous creative mind. She wrote The Midnight Disease and has published other articles. She's just She wrote The Midnight Disease, an award-winning nonfiction book, and she's been featured on Anderson Cooper, in the Washington Post, San Francisco Chronicle, and she's given a TEDx talk, and she was featured in a documentary called Bedside Manner, which receives a nomination for an Academy Award. So she's just an extraordinary person with a wide variety of interests, both scientific and in the humanities and artistic. She and I are both neurologists, and we, of course, can connect on that, nerd type level. And she and I have both suffered the loss of two sons. So I'm looking very forward to the conversation today. Let's get started. Good morning, Dr. Flaherty. Thank you for joining me today for this conversation.
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I appreciate your generosity. So we've been, emailing back and forth, and loosely we're going to discuss empathy, compassion, mirror neurons, and the continuum to shared psychotic disorder. So I just wanted to give you my appreciations about your book, The Midnight Disease. Thank you so much for writing it.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and I was saying before we started, the way you talk about your family and including your children in your writing life was really healing for me. And particularly at the time you wrote that book, it was really brave, and people didn't do that a lot. And I just want to thank you deeply for your transparency about that.
Oh, thanks. People are always telling me, you're so brave, but I think I was just disinhibited or self-obsessed.
Either way, I think it was beneficial for people and beneficial for me. So, lots of things are a mixed bag, and yes, I appreciate that. So I'm aware of your interest in empathy and compassion in patient care and how it affects the brain. And I just wondered if you had some initial thoughts about that.
Yeah, I don't want to start out in a negative way, but I worry about the way the concept of empathy, especially emotional empathy, is used these days. I think it's a really powerful force, but it's also not necessarily a force for good. Empathy, you can use your emotional sense of what your opponent fears in order to win the debate or the war and so forth. Empathy is just a tool, and it's not necessarily tied all that closely with niceness and compassion. There's a bit of a relation, but not strong.
Yeah, well, I agree with you that empathy can be invoked for positivity and not so positivity in human relationships, for sure. Yeah, and for me, which we talked about, I think a seed of empathy is needed for compassion, which we will get into, and compassion is a positive force. But let's go into the intricacies of empathy some first.
Sorry, it had the interest in just
talk about empathy. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, me talk about empathy.
Well, I will first if you want me to. Would you like me to?
Yeah. Why don't you start? I mean, I can just give a spiel, but
sure. So in my own life, I've seen empathy actually go both ways, because when I was a young doctor in training, and some of the comments you've made about empathy being used as a defense mechanism, I definitely did that in moments of overwhelm. When such huge suffering was involved, sometimes I couldn't really tolerate what I was seeing. And I think I distanced myself by using this, oh, how sad. And so it was at those moments, I think I was using it in that way because I couldn't tolerate what I was seeing. I didn't have the wherewithal experience to be able to do that at the time. Yeah.
That reminds me of a time when I was listening to a well-known poet who was engaged with an organization to talk about empathy to doctors, and she was saying, I just don't understand how doctors can get so numb to suffering, because even reading Bleak House, each time I read it, it's so painful that I just have to put my head down on the desk and weep. And I was moved by that, but I also thought, that's why you're not a doctor. I mean, empathy can make you flee the room if you feel someone's pain and it's unbearable. So that it almost well, clip this part out, but it seemed a little self-congratulatory and inappropriate.
Yes. Right. It's so it takes a lot of introspection to, in my opinion, to really think about how we're using empathy, and how it can be, a seed for compassion, or if it's just a defense mechanism. Yeah, because we can't cry all day, or we can't be doctors. I mean, sometimes I've wanted to cry and I couldn't let myself cry because I'm like, this person needs me to be the doctor, not the weeper, right?
Oh, that's such a great way of putting it. I remember once I was giving a death talk to a family in the ICU, and it was really sad, this young mother. And as I was talking, I teared up a little bit. And afterwards, the social worker was like, are you okay? Are you okay? And I thought, well, I just teared up a little bit. That seemed appropriate. So I asked my chairman, Ann Young, who is this, well-known person, I was like, is it okay to cry when your patient's dying? And she's like, oh, of course it is. But just make sure it just wells up in your eyes. If it starts rolling down your cheek, then they feel like they have to take care of you, and that's really inappropriate. And I loved her distinction, that you just want to look a little sad. You want to mirror their emotion in a way that's not overwhelming to the person you're talking to. Right, because we are playing a role, and the role is to serve, right?
Yeah. And be there for them. And I mean, I am human. I'm able to most of the time, but there are moments where, for whatever reason, whatever I ate today, didn't sleep, got my own emotional whatever, it's more challenging sometimes. But yes, we're trying to occupy the place for them. Yeah. So let's kind of flip to the other side of empathy, which I call over-identification. I describe it as having an aspect of over-identification. Do you have any experience with that?
A little bit. I first think of several of my patients who are so empathic, they'll describe it as a disease. And, they'll say, I can't be happy unless everybody in the room is happy. And they'll take on other people's values or emotional goals, even if they know that they're wrong. And sometimes I've even talked to them about how to be less empathic, stop making eye contact, do the things that doctors do, in my own experience, I'm not particularly an emotionally empathic person. I'm not quite a psychopath, but that's not a strong thing for me. I have felt it in a couple of situations where it seemed like it could in everybody's empathic case, it can be misleading. You can make a wrong judgment about what somebody else is feeling, and you'll be feeling your emotions and not theirs. But it's especially true with children or your own children. And I think that's probably where I've experienced it the most strongly. It wasn't too disruptive, only because I always remind myself, could be making it up. And maybe an example of that is when I was little, my mother would see me and my sister playing outside in light clothes when it was cold. And she'd say, oh, you have to come in, and you're so cold, you're going to get cold. And we're like, we're fine, we're warm. And she'd say, I have to get you in a sweater because I'll be cold until you have the sweater on. And I thought, well, that's stupid, until it happened to me with my own children.
Yeah. Right. So there's, of course, as both mothers, we're both mothers, and we've both lost 2 sons. And we share that very difficult experience. And, there's the empathetic resonance between a mother and children is very strong. And, I've had, it's been positive, and it's caused a lot of suffering in my life because, children need that to grow and thrive. But for me, when I had described, and we had talked about this earlier, when my first son became psychotic, and I could see into him, okay? I was in a certain sense, right? Mm-hmm. So mirror neurons is, that's what I proposed was the mechanism for seeing into him. right? Where it's like we think we create a virtual reality of what the person's going through, but of course we can be wrong. I certainly have been wrong too. But yeah, it's very difficult. And what I was saying is, most listeners probably haven't been exposed to psychosis, but many have been exposed to addiction. Addiction is really common. And I have addiction in my family also. And those of us, even as doctors, I've had this when my patients have addictions. And it's that I get into this thing, I have been vulnerable to imagine I have more power to fix something than I do. Okay? Where I actually can't change certain things. And it's important for me to reel that in because, and I can do it with my patients, but with my son, I was so over-identified in a way that was dangerous for my psyche with his hallucinations and his suffering that I was really, in a way, paralyzed. It was really difficult. And so that's the other side of empathy, using it as like I talked about, a mechanism where you're not involved. It's like withdrawing, but then it can be disabling. I can't be happy till everybody's happy, right? I can't be happy till my loved one is sober, that kind of thing, which neither of those things is actually true on a profound level, but sometimes we can't notice. Yeah.
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 This may be a tangent. The times that I've found it helpful to either identify less or more with a patient, you can often use. Let me start again. For me, a problem with the concept of empathy is it's so interior. I mean, it was invented by psychoanalysts who believed that they shouldn't be showing anything to the patient, that they should have this blank face, but inside they should be suffering the patient's pain. And of course, for most patients, unless they've spent a lot of time in analysis, that inner stuff is not helping them at all. They want to see what the psychiatrist is feeling, and the psychiatrist is saying, that's none of your business. To me, there's a much more human middle ground where you can mirror a patient's emotions to show that you get it. You don't necessarily have to feel it. And for me, to concentrate on expressing the patient's sadness back to them, say, wow, you must be so upset about that. That gives me something to do so that I'm not over empathizing with them, and I'm also not detached. And then it becomes a form of communication, and empathy has this kind of inner claustrophobic quality that I think can be really detrimental to relationships, especially when doctors have these boundaries that they feel like they have to maintain.
Yeah, that's, I love that reflection, and that kind of leads right into the things we had talked about with functional brain imaging and empathy versus compassion, which is, of course, right up our alley here as fellow neurologists. So there is a monk named Matthew Ricard, whose brain has been studied with functional MRI, EEG, and there are types of meditation on empathy versus compassion. And in these studies, what it showed is when he was doing empathy, the anterior cingulate and the anterior mid-cingulate cortex was very lit up, and he said he was absolutely miserable. Okay, he was suffering terribly because he was in complete empathy with seeing these suffering children, and he found it quite uncomfortable. And the researchers wanted to know, do you want to take a break or do you want to go right into the compassion meditation? And he said, no, I need to go to compassion. I need relief in my body, and I need to convert all this. So in the compassion meditation, completely different networks lit up. It was the medial orbitofrontal cortex and the ventral striatum. These things are involved in, motivation.
Yeah.
And dopamine, that's motivation. And so if one takes the internal stance of the intention to care, he relaxed, he felt better. And I mean, I haven't had my brain studied on functional MRI, but it certainly reflects my personal experience. Any comments about that?
Oh yeah, it's so important that he was doing when he switched to compassion was much more action oriented. Even if it's an addict that you know you can't save, you can still want to help, just like a palliative care doctor knows the patient's going to die, but there's still always something you can do. And that action that brings it out into the real world, into something that the patient can benefit from, that seems to me therapeutic for the person as well. Like after I was sick, so I had this big manic break, helping other patients was so calming because it was doing something. It gave me a sense of being an agent rather than this passive victim of my own nuttiness. And that's the concept of empathy. The original term was invented by an art philosopher of art who said, this is what we feel when we're looking at, a painting, The Rape of the Sabine Women, where we know we can't do anything for those women. So what is it we're feeling? We're not feeling sympathy because we know we can't help them. We're feeling empathy. And that's the sterility of it. It's like saying, I give up. I can't help you. I can't reach you. Whereas compassion is reaching out and thinking you have at least something you can do.
Yeah, it's, I found it transformative in my psyche to be able to switch from empathy to compassion when taking care of my children. And I was somehow given the message that, one can detach with love. And so what I mean by that is detach from control, detach from imagining I have enough power to change the outcome over certain situations. And to me, love is a verb. I think that's a book, but it is. Yeah. And that love, that kind of verb is the compassion. And so that somehow, when I was in over-identification with my son's psychosis, that I was really in danger, somehow, maybe I had read it, I'll never really know how, I was able to switch to compassion, and I calmed down. I was able to be better and calmer and actually help him more and be more productive instead of have a breakdown myself, which I could have definitely had. I'm grateful, and there's always going to be some mystery. I don't know. Any thoughts?
Yeah, it's a, I think all of us know the spectrum among doctors between the feelers, like the psychiatrists in the old sense anyway, and then the doers, the surgeons who, I'm not going to feel your pain, but I'm going to try and help you by cutting off your leg or whatever.
Right.
And the danger we have when we start wanting to help the patient is that we get these delusions of control that we are going to be able to save someone. And those are addictive too, like the way medicine is so cure focused. And then if we can't cure you, we don't even want to see you in our office. So that this middle ground where you can acknowledge that, there's so much of fate that's going to take things out of your hand, but you can still act in a way that is the best you can do. That kind of humility combined with action, it's a kind of it's a balancing act, but it's way more comfortable than either end of that spectrum.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. The middle way is so powerful because the middle way that you're describing, in my opinion, in my experience, is where we can act skillfully for the patient and ourselves. The middle way is slippy and I fall off all the time. But I like to try to come back. I do try to come back. Yes.
I wonder if you've seen a wonderful YouTube video called "It's Not About the Nail," which the chief of our psychiatry department, it's like 1 minute long and it's very funny. It makes everyone watch because it's the spectrum of two ways of helping people. And a man and this couple, a man and a woman, are talking, and she's telling him about his headache, and he keeps trying to fix it. And she's like, I don't want you to fix it. I just want you to listen. And he's like, okay. And she's like, and telling him about the headache. And then the camera pulls back, and you realize the reason she has a headache is she has a nail stuck in her head. And he's like, if you just pulled out the nail, you'd feel so much better. And she's like, you're not listening to me. And so you can feel both people's pain, but you just think she should pull out the nail. It's hard, to balance that. But I think everybody should watch that video.
Yeah, it's a really nice representation of the paradox, right? The paradox of both people have a point there.
Yeah.
If that brings up, I wanted to circle back around to, we talked about mirror neurons, and interestingly, the psych in the communication literature when we reflect back what they say, a patient says, like, I hear that you have a terrible headache. It's called mirroring, which
Yeah.
I think that's no accident somehow.
Yeah, people have such people got so excited about the mirror neurons as the basis for empathy, but they have so many more basic practical intercommunication tasks. I mean, they're important for imitative learning, they're important for language acquisition, they're important for expressing your emotions to other people. And the empathy stuff is almost like, now I'm exaggerating, but to some extent it's a side effect that's maybe not so helpful. But mirroring, there's almost no case, I'm sure there's a few cases, but there's very few cases where it's not helpful. Like, I was taught in medical school, you should mirror sadness and say, wow, that must be hard for you. But like negative emotions like anxiety or anger, you don't mirror them, you have to be calm. And that, I eventually learned late in life, was very wrong. You should even mirror anger, but mirror the person's anger and not say, I hate you too. You say, you must hate me. And you say it in an angry way, but I know you must be really angry with me. That's so patronizing that the other person is going to think you don't even get it. So in that sense, mirroring it's primitive, but it's like way more sensible than a lot of the tailspins we get ourselves in.
It is primitive, but we have primitive brains in a lot of ways. Our brains are so primitive in this very complex world, and those needs are still there. Yeah. And they need honoring, and it's sometimes I forget it too. I'm all involved in thinking about my science and my medicine, and I can, then I'm like, wait, yeah. So that's important to bring it back to that. Yeah, and it's hard to mirror people's anger because, in my experience, I find patients more angry than ever because they have insurance denials, they don't get their medicines approved. Yeah, the system that we care for people in seems to be functioning more poorly, and they feel anger about it. I actually feel anger about it. And so then we've got, I'm trying to ratchet it down. Yeah, any thoughts on that?
I do, in that, for me anyway, mirroring someone else's anger is so much easier than trying to be calm. If someone has a very strong emotion, I'm going to be clenching my fists. Whether or not I'm for or against them, I'm going to start, steam is going to come out of my ears. And I want to let it out in a bodily way. But if I can let it out and remind myself I'm expressing their anger and transform it in that way, then I don't want to punch anyone, And so it gives me something to do that's so much easier than trying to try to pretend to be calm. Like the whole act, the scientific doctor act of impartiality and so forth, can send really disturbing messages to people. And it's easier for me to act out someone else's anger than to suppress my own.
Right, the cold fish doctor. Yeah, people are offended and hurt by that. I understand that.
The study, it's called the still face paradigm that I think it was T. Barry Brazelton, a child psychologist, invented. He wanted a non-painful way to stress infants, and so he would just have it to get the child with his mother, and the mother was just told to not make any expressions for 2 minutes. So she would just freeze. And the kids would first try to attack their attention, and then they would gradually panic and freak out. And all of us revert to being children when we're suffering. And if someone gives us that dead robot face, we freak out.
Yeah, we don't feel seen. And I guess for me, I wish I would have known this years ago, but using these nonviolent communication techniques, I think it's Marshall, is it Rosenblum? I think is his last name. That's helped me a lot and I wish I would have known this years ago, the way to talk to people to help them be seen and honor myself at the same time. So I'm late to the game, but at least I found it now.
At least we neurologists are. Maybe I think a lot of times I'll tell a psychiatrist this and they're like, duh, of course. But you tell neurologists this and they're like, oh, no, that can't be. We're supposed to be calm when we talk to angry people.
Yes. Yeah. So let me just ask, to circle back around to our topic, have you ever seen a case, a group or family, 2 individuals with shared psychotic disorder?
I think psychosis is a spectrum. I think we agree about that. But the thing that I see the most often in my practice are contagious movement disorders, for example. And I've had a lot of experience with patients who have functional tic disorders, what they now call TikTok tics. And these are really disabling for the patient and seem like jokes to everybody else, and they're contagious. So I remember I was on the Anderson Cooper show back in the day when the Leroy, New York girls, there was an epidemic of functional tics, and it spread from, this kind of functional stuff always spreads among young women. It's partly because they're the most empathic. They notice each other's behaviors. Like, we make fun of cheerleaders for being more susceptible to this, but it's that they actually care about their teammates. They notice what their bodies are doing. So med students, we all get functional disorders like, what med student disease, where we read about something and we think we have it, but it doesn't spread because we're not all that emotionally connected to our other students. So these students would pick it up from each other, and it was awful for them, So do we call that psychotic? Do we call it a mirror neuron disease? I don't know, but it's very, very common. And TikTok tics, of course, were probably what was going on with the Salem witch trials, where these girls were starting to get these weird behaviors and sudden sharp pains, and it spread.
Do you think this is an example of emotional entrainment?
I think so. I mean, if there's a technical meaning of the word, I might not match it, but it's not just emotional; it's physical too.
Yeah,
And people will even say, they'll even say, "I'm not even that stressed," and then this just started, and whatever tic it was. But so I believe them when they say they're not stressed, but there's something else going on.
So how do they get better? Because I know about this story, but I didn't hear about what happened with these girls.
Yeah, so most of them got better fairly quickly. And, there was a lot of it was being spread by social media, and that's still a huge issue with TikTok tics. So just not watching other people do that, it does help. Like, insight doesn't set you free. Actions set you free, really. But insight sometimes help because they realized, I'm not going to die. This is not, lead poisoning or whatever they were worried about. And then as their nervous system would calm down, the tics would get better, and then they'd get calmer. So there was this autonomic de-escalation that sometimes can be pretty quick. But these days, as I'm sure you know, what's been even more helpful for people with any kind of functional movement disorder is to go past the insight that, oh, this is just something my brain is doing to me, to desensitizing themselves through action, like through physical therapy and through rehearsing behaviors that compete with the tics and things like that. And it can be so rewarding to treat patients because they can get better really fast. And they go from being very disabled and very miserable to being so grateful.
Have you ever used mirror box therapy in these cases?
I have, not in a case of a tic disorder, but in a few cases of pain. They've used it for it was originally used for phantom limb pain, but you can do it even if people have both their hands. I've used it for that, and yeah, it's not just a coincidence that mirror box therapy probably invokes our mirror neurons, and we're having empathy for ourselves in a way. Like, we see our good hand superimposed on our bad hand, and it moves and it's not feeling pain, and then we sort of transfer that feeling to the bad hand in a way that doesn't always work, but it's pretty fascinating, especially because people can do that even though they know it's a trick, even though they know it's not their hand. But what's happening is so much more primitive than our cortex,
Right. So I've used it for complex regional pain syndrome because I'm a subspecialist in pain, and it has helped lessen it. When I've been desperate, I'm running out of things, and for some people it has helped. And I think it's the same mechanism. Of course, I don't know. I'm speculating, but that's my guess. That they include the new hand, meaning the hand they're looking in the mirror, in their brain image and their self-image, and they're able to ratchet it down. But you brought up something very interesting about their autonomic nervous system of the young women with the tics. So I really love vagus nerve stimulation. Okay, external. I know
these are the external ones.
External for headache. That's how I first started using it. It's been FDA indicated for headache for almost 10 years. But now I'm using it for a lot of pain syndromes, post-concussive syndromes, because people can do personalized medicine on themselves. They can watch their heart rate variability go up and improve. So this is one of my hacks. I'm really enjoying it, and I wanted to know if you're doing that too.
I haven't done that, but people have asked me about vagus nerve stimulators, and I've been very encouraging because it makes so much sense to me that that decreasing the sympathetic drive. So many of these patients have trauma histories.
Yeah.
Their nervous systems are so hypervigilant. They're always in like sympathetic storm, and then the parasympathetic nervous system's trying to cope for that and overdoes it, and they're slammed back and forth. And so we can talk afterwards about what types of stimulators you recommend and everything, because I think that could be so helpful. And just the feeling that it gives them a way of controlling it and a story to make sense of what's happening that doesn't involve, what they're getting all the time from their brain is these messages that something's terribly, terribly wrong in their body. Right. And to combat that takes action, and to just sit there and feel, and to try and be with the pain or do some of the things that people tell sufferers is not nearly as helpful as getting interested in a new technique and getting engaged in that. Right.
It gives them a positive action to take for themselves. And there's scientific backing. So obviously I'm all on board with that. It's been helpful for people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else you'd like to add about what we've talked about so far?
No.
Okay, so I'm interested. I'd like to hear where's your interest right now? What are the things you're most interested in pursuing and thinking about at this time?
So I have an interest in empathy, but the thing that interests me the most for a long time has been our sense of agency. And just as I was alluding to, giving people a sense of agency helps them decrease their sense of being passive sufferers. I see a lot of patients with movement disorders and psychiatric disorders, and they're all disorders of voluntary action, and they come across to observers as if they're disorders of volition, like he just doesn't want to get better. I've heard that so much about my patients with Parkinson's disease. And so an example would be the wife will say to me, well, he'll say, I can't take out the garbage, I have Parkinson's. But then his grandson comes over, and all of a sudden he has a lot of energy and he can throw a ball around like he just wasn't trying. And I could, if I were that spouse, I'd have that same gut reaction, like you're just yanking my chain. And sometimes it helps to say, you have to have enough dopamine to have the ability to want something, to be motivated. And when I can give him some levodopa and then he can take the garbage out, it calms everybody down. Because often the patient himself feels like, I'm just not trying. Yeah. And so we make this huge distinction in medicine between things that are volitional or, like laziness, and then things that are symptoms, which are involuntary. So what do we do with disorders of voluntary action? They're in this netherworld where you have functional disorders and addictions and depression and all Parkinson's and dystonia and tics. And to me, that sense of who do we blame, who do we get to blame, and who do we have to be nice to because it's not their fault, it's very seductive for people to look at trying to put everybody in two boxes.
Right. So the binary, response to watching patients and loved ones, I wonder how it seems almost hardwired into us. Some researchers say that when we can go all or nothing at all, it lets our brain rest because it's so energetically expensive to hold that uncertainty. So I have compassion when I do it and others do it because I understand it's requiring less energy. To me, this reflects another difficulty you and I have already talked about, which is the imaginary mind-body split. That's not real because in our field, in orthopedics, everybody can see the broken arm. It's very clear. We're like, oh, broken arm. For us, right now, we can't see it most of the time, and so therefore it's quite imaginary and theoretical, and therefore subject to question, judgment, blame, blah blah blah, and sadly it increases the suffering. Public education, would help, but this is a rich issue, very rich issue. Yeah.
Yeah. It's even more difficult than a lot of dualities. We love to make distinctions between the red shirts and the blue shirts and so forth. But with the mind and the body, so much of our dualism is present at birth, and it does help. Whenever there's a paradigm called the hyperactive agency detection device that Dan Dennett popularized. I think it was Justin Barrett's term originally, but he said we're all over-determined to if we don't know what's going on, we look for the agent who did it on purpose, and it makes sense. We live in social communities, and agents are like the most important things in our life, much more dangerous and helpful than mechanical events. So whenever if we don't know why the patient's not getting better, we have to blame somebody. We could blame ourselves as bad doctors, or it's so much easier to blame the patient and say, you just don't want to get better. You just don't want to go to school. Even if the patient loved school, secretly you're worried about the competition, and we make up these stories the same way that we used to make up stories about, it's thundering, so God must be angry, and he's probably angry at you because of something you did,
Yeah, so that brings up something really interesting that I've dealt with. So what about blaming the disease? Okay, so should we blame the disease?
It's certainly better to blame an inanimate object, that you're not going to hurt the object's feeling, and
right.
And this is maybe a tangent, but when I was sick, everybody was trying to tell me there was me and then there was the disease. So I had, this bipolar disorder. I found that I was very identified with it. All of a sudden I was like, no. I even at one point when I was kind of psychotic thought I had a sort of divine mission to get more and more depressed. I should be as depressed as I absolutely could be. It was there was something in my body that was making me depressed, which of course was true. My body was ill, and it felt intentional. And I couldn't say that's just my illness. And I thought, well, I'm so integrated, this is good. And I'm reading all these papers saying, no, you should separate your illness from yourself. I've lost my train of thought, so maybe I'll come back to it. But
okay. Yeah, this is fascinating. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this because.
No, I just remembered what I was going to say.
Ahead, please proceed. Uh-huh.
A thing that really brought it home to me was in depression. There's that depression index. I think it's the Hamilton D, the HAM-D score it's a test you give to people when you already know they're depressed to see how depressed they are. And question 17 is, does the person think they're depressed? And if they say no, they actually get another point on the depression scale because it shows they're delusional. And so before I was depressed, I thought, well, that's just like a catch-22. That seems really unfair. And then my psychiatrist would point out that the more depressed I got, the more I would blame myself. And I'd say, well, I'm just making it up. I'm doing this for attention. Yeah. And she said that I had a delusional psychochondriasis and that I thought I was imagining my mental illness, but that thought was delusional. So my head was kind of spinning there. But that sense of agency that I had was an illness,
Yeah. So did they use the word, and I'm going to try to pronounce it correctly, anosognosia with you?
I think she might have, we often save that for people who just aren't able to identify emotions. And in that narrow sense, I was a little bit too able to identify my emotions, but I definitely had a lack of insight. And she would tell me that all the time.
I should have defined the term. So we can talk about the definition. But the definition is lack of awareness that one is ill.
Yeah, so I knew I was ill, but I thought it was important to be ill, so it was a little bit, I'm splitting hairs. Yeah, I was nuts.
So to me, anosognosia is really common because how many people have I seen in my lifetime that their whole family knows they have an addiction and it's deadly and they truly don't believe they're addicted or psychotic, depressed. So that's very interesting that I see how a patient or somebody could feel angry because if you say you're not depressed, it's a point against you. I guess to me it's anosognosia and very interesting. Yeah.
But now it's so helpful when I see people who are depressed and they're saying, "Oh no, I'm just making this up," and often it'll be psychiatrists who should have insight, right? And I'll tell them the thing about depression is it takes away your insight. And I know you're not going to believe me, a neurologist, telling you, a psychiatrist, that you're depressed, but why don't you just try an SSRI and see what happens? Let's just be agnostic about the diagnosis.
Right.
And afterwards, as soon as they get undepressed, they're like, oh, I had no idea how depressed I was.
Yeah, so it is a loss of insight, however we want to name that, which can happen to any of us, right? And like we were describing earlier, I've lost insight in relationships before with, you know, treating patients and with my family, so it's tricky.
And with addiction, it's especially interesting because then we blame the patient for repressing their knowledge. Like they're doing it on purpose. They're just not wanting to realize that they have a choice, when it's no different from, no one ever tells a depressed patient, you're just deliberately repressing your knowledge that you're ill. We just see it as part of the illness, but with addiction, we're like, it's their fault.
Yeah, there's a profound lack of understanding about addiction as a brain disorder in society in general. I mean, I think we're moving a little bit, it's getting better, but there's a long way to go. And hopefully as we get better science and understanding, it will help decrease the stigma, because there's still so much heartbreaking stigma about brain illnesses. Yeah.
I'm going to just be a stickler when we get more understanding. Again, I don't know how often insight fixes things, but as soon as we have treatments for addiction, then, okay, it's a disease. And that's so clearly true with overweight. Now with the GLP-1 agonists, all of a sudden, everyone can see it as not my fault. I should take a pill. And that was just not available, no matter how much we read about mechanisms of obesity and how you couldn't get out of it and how it could be inherited and, you know, intergenerational trauma. Nothing helped until there were GLP-1 agonists.
Well, that's a great reflection, and I agree with you. And I love the drugs. I've seen it save many of my patients' lives, and their families' attitudes toward them and society's attitudes toward them, I think, have changed in a positive way. And that in itself can be healing for people. Yeah. So let's circle back to blaming the disease.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think blaming the disease over blaming the person or the doctor when everything is being done in the most skillful way possible is probably functional. Okay. Because it takes the pressure off both sides. But then I guess I get concerned that people can have that if the anger gets too much, it can actually be a distraction, okay? And that can go off the rails too. So, you know, we're getting into it, I'll go into a different topic right now, maybe a tangent, but so one of my spiritual advisors said, make friends with bipolar disorder when both my sons were sick. And at first I was like, that's crazy. You know, I felt angry somewhat about that being, I felt resistance and some anger about that being said to me. But then later I was like, okay, well, let's just start with curiosity. Okay.
Yeah.
And curiosity is I'm still curious about it. Okay. And curiosity is rich ground. Okay. And for me, it ratchets down the emotional reactivity. So that's been a good path. This is all really a complex topic.
I completely agree. There's so much of a role for positive curiosity about illness in that it's very hard to be afraid of something that you're also interested in. You know, one is a approach emotion and one's an avoidance emotion. And a lot of us became doctors because we were afraid of illness and pain. And then you start studying it and you get kind of fascinated. And pretty soon we're the type of people at cocktail parties who are like totally interested in talking about cottage cheesy discharge and sutures and like bleeding and stuff. And we enjoy it, right? And it's a very useful defense. I think I definitely took it too far when I had like very active bipolar disorder. And I remember my psychiatrist telling me, like, you are just way too interested in your delusions. You know, you find them fascinating and that's not great. And I'm like, I know, but they're so interesting. And then I would wonder, am I making it up? No one gets interested in their delusions, so there was that spiral. But the thing that was the hardest, and I think it's something that we should all keep in mind when patients hate their illness, is when they start to get better. That's also really stressful for people. And so there's the sense in which you can blame everything on your illness and say, well, I can't help it, I'm the victim of an illness and I need to take a pill. And there's also when that reduces your sense of agency, then you don't try hard. And so I loved saying, well, I can't do that. I have bipolar disorder. I can't be on your committee. That was great. I've used that as much as I can in my career. But there was a point at which I realized I'm really not that ill anymore. And I was giving a book tour on the midnight disease, and I was sort of like the poster child for sick doctors, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm talking to to doctors, and some people are saying, oh, thank you. I've been so ill, and you were sharing with me, I started feeling like a fraud because I wasn't as sick as I used to be. Mm-hmm. So again, there's that sense of fraudness that not just for me, but so many of my patients don't really know where to place themselves on that spectrum of ill versus well.
That's fascinating. And we do move around, psychologically and with our health and our internal conditions. And it's hard to maintain objectivity about that, especially when it's really intense. I wonder, do you think that's a form of imposter syndrome that everybody talks about now?
So yeah, so many of my residents and the med students have imposter syndrome. I kind of never had that because I didn't have a lot of distinction between reality, like pretending to be a doctor and being a doctor. They seem like kind of similar to me. And also, luckily I had a very secure upbringing and so forth. But imposter syndrome, it felt a little different. Like just the implications of imposter syndrome are you've been put in a situation where people are going to find you out. I wasn't worried about being found out so much because people were, I would go to psychiatrist after psychiatrist and they'd say, oh yeah, you're a little psychotic. And I'd feel relief for like 1 minute. And then it was me that was the problem and not the people that were going to discover me. But that's splitting hairs, really. I think that notion of identifying with your illness, though, is so important now because there's so many people that self-diagnose, for instance, with autism spectrum. And there was a really lovely essay in the New York Times a couple of years ago by a young woman who'd been diagnosed as an adult with autism. And she wrote about how it had been incredibly helpful for her as useful to understand her life, and also disturbing because people would say, you're not autistic, you're like way too empathic, and you don't act autistic, and stuff that made her feel, like an imposter, of course. But she said that was really helpful the first couple of years of having that diagnosis. And she said, but I've kind of moved on. I incorporated what I learned from that. And now I don't go to like autism meetings once a week, and I don't disagree with the diagnosis, but it's no longer a huge part of my identity the way it was when I first started, which helped me kind of think about it too, because, I was taught bipolar is for life, but now it's not a huge part of my mind, and I've actually been well for so long that I again start thinking, well, maybe I made it up, like I should be sick again. But it's just not big anymore the way it was, which I'm happy with.
So there's these schools of thought where we transcend and include our suffering, our difficulties. And what I feel like I hear in the story about the young woman that was diagnosed with autism in later life is, yes, she transcended it, she included it, she knows it's part of her, but she's not like focused on that anymore. I think that can be done with grief, okay? And I'm not talking about in a performative way. I'm talking about in this internal way. It's something that's always with me, with most of us that have lost somebody very integral to their life. It's not like you forget it, but it is just integral. It can be included, and we can go forward in a way that is possible.
The sense of identity that people have, it's not a neurological concept, but people have so much trouble incorporating an illness into their body images, like even amputees after losing a limb and so forth. And I do worry that some of it is that we've been taught that we have this unitary identity. Like the self-psychologists in the 1960s, where you're supposed to have strong ego boundaries, and we change all the time. Right. And I've even had people ask me, can someone ever change? There's ways in which we don't, there's ways in which we do, but the belief that people can't change makes it even harder to incorporate some new fact, like both my sons died or whatever it is. Right. It's just devastating. And the problem with grief, of course, is when you're full of grief, you don't want to lose it. That's the last thing you have left of the person who died. and yet you know you will lose it, and there's that struggle too. So
Yeah, so I don't know if you're familiar with the work. I've forgotten the name of the book, but it's, The Grieving Brain, I think is the name of the book.
no, I don't know that. Yeah,
It's a
tell me.
wonderful book. Okay, and so what it talks about is that grief is actually, there's a huge amount of learning that goes on because we literally have to learn that the person is not there anymore. Because we geolocate our loved ones at all times.
Yes.
Okay, we picture them like, okay, they're sitting at their desk at their house. They're going to call me on the phone, right? So then when they die, we know they're not at their desk. They're not going to be calling me, but we are anticipating that because we've geolocated them, right? We don't even we map them. Okay, this is what the book says. And so then we have to learn, okay, and rewire and to the new reality. And so that resonates with me. And I'm just summarizing, I'm giving a summary, but she gives a lot of evidence, a lot of brain evidence, and that makes sense to me. And it is like the change, it's such a change in self-image.
Absolutely.
A massive
And
change in self-image, yeah.
I think for you and me, that understanding what's happening in the brain is probably more helpful for us than for some people, but everybody knows that experience of when someone dies or when they leave, you're looking for them everywhere. And talk about the psychotic spectrum where you start seeing their face everywhere, because you're so desperate to see them again. Or it's not even that. There's this expectation. I haven't seen him for a while. Usually I see him once an hour. He's got to be here somewhere. I'm just not being sensitive enough. And so we change our perceptions until we start seeing them. And that's such a basic phenomenon. I don't know if there's evidence in her book about the importance of seeing people who are dead. I've always had this belief that you should see someone who's dead, you should see their corpse. And I don't, probably there's been studies, but it really helps.
There is. Okay, and that's why, just if you go back in the 70s when they disappeared all these people in Brazil and Chile, okay, it's really cruel because people, the way we work, we do need to see that for the closure, and it's a challenge. It can be worked through, but it's a challenge to the grief process, and she goes into that, and it does make sense because we are primitive and concrete, and we do need to see it.
Yeah.
I mean, but we don't always get our needs met on a lot of levels. So it can be worked through, but it creates another layer according to her thinking. And I agree. And that brings up something else I wanted to touch on, which is funeral parlor mania. Okay, because whenever my first son died, my second son actually was psychotic. But then, I'd heard about funeral parlor mania, which is in the old literature. It's, funeral parlors, we don't even use that language anymore, so obviously this is old language where people get manic and in the immediate aftermath, right? And that did happen to my other son, and then I was like, my God, this is what I read about in the books. Okay, so grief is a huge challenge, and yes, I watched him have that experience. And like we talk about a spectrum, I don't think I had a psychosis, but like many people, I saw their faces in the street. Okay, I would see them at the airport, and I would look. I'm like, wait, that's not them. Because you want to see them so much.
And then each time that happens, it's another loss. There's this sense of recognition, and then they're gone again. It's just so devastating.
So hard.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about funeral parlor mania?
I love that. I hadn't heard that concept. I totally believe it. Actually, in Boston, we still have funeral parlors. I'm so like, maybe we're just antique, but it makes complete sense to me. Mania is so often a stress reaction, and I still have that, even though I'm pretty pretty stable. I think every time I have a significant illness, like I fell off a cliff, like this 30-foot cliff a couple years ago.
Oh wow.
And luckily, I came through pretty well, but I got very hypomanic for the first week or so afterwards, and I became obsessed with reconstructing my fall, and I was doing all this kind of like the people that get obsessed with the Kennedy assassination, plotting my trajectory and things. Totally silly, but I was so into it, and I was really manic, and then I got kind of depressed, and I was worried that my body was rotting, and that thing where mania is a useful response when it's controlled. You know, you have a lot of energy to escape whatever's going on. And then your body is talking about the autonomic nervous system. Your body says, oh my God, you're spending way too much energy. We have to shut this down. And so they slam you into this other world where you can't move and you can't think. And that funeral mania is like, I get that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, I witnessed it. And I think where, for me, I felt it just like that feeling of searching, that obsessive searching.
Yeah.
It didn't actually cross over to full mania, but it was probably like on the hype. I mean, just this frantic searching is the feeling of it. So I can understand how it can happen. It makes sense to me. Yeah, and I've seen it. And it actually happened to a friend of mine who lost her child to actually Tay-Sachs. She had hypergraphia afterward, and a grief reaction.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And hypergraphia is such a common thing with so many people that get ill. I have like a whole shelf of illness memoirs that people have written, and it's so important to like communicate what we're going through. I think it often feels like, you know, we're just looking for help. If we tell our story and if we're moving in the right way, somebody will come along and fix it, you know, and so people who have, you know, no other history of mental illness, they start writing poetry, they start, you know, writing down everything that happened to them. And it's sort of adaptive.
I mean, I think it's adaptive. I did it myself, and I don't think it reached hypergraphia, but I think it was functional because it helps metabolize this massive amount of emotional energy.
Yeah.
And I mean, I was doing it for a lot of reasons, and I wasn't consciously thinking about that at the time, but I do think it helps do that. And that's important, and that's actually a healing impulse. Yeah.
I often thought, like, when I thought about my hypergraphic episodes afterwards, it seemed kind of protective. Like, some people just have pressured speech, right? And they talk to everybody. And I knew I was going to lose my listener very soon. Like, I was already collaring people in the hallway. So when I was hypergraphic, it was a way of like diverting that to save my friendships, so I wouldn't have to bore everyone, and I could just put it in a box and then shut the box.
That is so kind and sweet that you had the
insight. I don't know. It was just, I knew I had to stop talking, and so I wrote. I don't know if it was necessarily kind. I was just trying to save myself.
Yes, I see that, but it does have a good heart to it. It seems to me. Yeah. Any other thoughts that you have that I haven't asked you that you would like to reflect on?
I want to go back to the topic of psychosis, which probably for listeners who haven't had a lot of exposure to it is less interesting, but to me that state was so interesting and so different, and I wonder, for me, the thing that surprised me about it was the sense of certainty. Like, there was a time, for instance, when I kind of thought I had this, I can't say belief, because part of me was like, that's bullshit. But, let me start that again without the swear. That's wrong. But I had this thought that I could take God's energy and beam it through my head at people who are ill and help them. And so my psychiatrist, who seemed very forlorn at the time, I later learned that her mentor had died, who she loved. And she was like, no, I'm fine, you know. But I was going to beam this at her and make her better. And part of me is like, that's wrong. And the other part was like, I don't care. I had this certainty that I could do that, and it was comforting, you know? And that there's an attraction to psychosis because it was so straightforward. Even if it's paranoid, even if you know someone's out to get you, that's awful, but at least you know. And it's better than the uncertainty of the regular world. And what really brought that home was that movie that they made of A Beautiful Mind, the biography of John Nash, where there's a scene where Russell Crowe, as the young John Nash, he's brought back to Earth by Haldol, and he's devastated because now all the things that he was certain about, everything is the real world, and it's all gray. Yeah. And I found that very moving.
Yeah, so this brings up a question for me. Is there, in your experience, a parallel feeling in psychosis and the sensation of awe? Like awe when we see something beautiful, beautiful art, opera. Does there feel like there's any connection for you? And I'm basing the question on the Stenton Hall syndrome. That's my
What's
question.
that? Tell me.
Okay, so the Stendhal syndrome is named for the writer Stendhal when he went to Florence for the first time and he saw this amazing art and he had a brief psychotic episode. So it's reported now, like when Jerusalem syndrome, when
Yes, yes,
a
that I've heard of.
Christian, a Jew, a Muslim goes to Jerusalem for the first time and they're just overwhelmed by what they've thought about their whole life and they have a brief psychotic episode, so the awe kicks that off. So what are your reflections on that?
I love that. I think it's a little bit more related to manic psychosis, of course. I do remember times when I was manic where once I was just biking home from the lab at night, and I had this sense of completely unattached awe at something. It was like maybe a excavator parked at the side of the road, and I just had this sense of awe. And then with just like the tiniest little change, it turned to fear. I mean, everyone knows awe and fear are related, but it was so interesting that it could become very positive and very negative, and there almost wasn't a difference. But what I think, the sense of when we see something beautiful, it may be a sort of low grade relationship in that anything that gives us such an autonomic rush is liable to trigger nuttiness and psychosis and so forth. The thing that's the most common trigger of manic episodes, of course, is lack of sleep. So if you're so full of awe and you're in Florence and you haven't slept on the train and everything, a lot of that probably has to do with it too. But awe, it's because it's, who wrote about that was William James in the Varieties of Religious Experience, where he talked about religious awe and how what an other state that is. So I guess my short answer of what I'm saying is yes. Yes.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think so. My son Colin actually went off into a mania when he was started in Rome. And so I think there was a parallel there. He was, it was part of the multiple triggers, and so it makes sense to me. And I mean, yeah, the awe is amazing when we go to these places. I mean, the goosebumps, there's such a physical reaction for many of us, including me, to go to these just, in the holy places like that. Yeah, it's...
and now let's add another, everything important has multiple causes. And then when you fly east, so there's the whole circadian stress thing. So people who fly east, it definitely it can elevate their mood, whereas if you fly west, it can lower your mood. And so part of the Jerusalem syndrome was, Pilgrims for Brooklyn were flying east to Jerusalem. So I'm sure that was contributing to your son's experience. And I have a patient who, an architect who was designing something in Tokyo, and he said, every time he flew to Tokyo, he would get really revved up, and every time he flew back, it would reverse. And we were trying to think how much of that is explained in terms of the emotional stuff that's going on, and how much is it the circadian rhythm. And the bottom line is you should try a light box and see if you can smoothly integrate the rhythm change, the circadian change, and see if that helps. But there's obviously multiple things going on.
Yeah, there's multiple things. There is literature about the circadian system and bipolar illness, which you're probably aware of. And, I posit the circadian system is one of the many factors that, which you touched on. And the light box therapy is a great idea. I should probably do it when I travel because sometimes the jet lag's rough.
So it's Sleepopolis has a website. It's called sleeprooster.com. It's a jet lag calculator, which is very easy to put your travel plans into, and it tells you what you should do with your sleep.
That's a good tip. I think I'm going to use it the next time I travel because I enjoy going to Asia and it's a long way, and I usually have some jet lag.
I'm curious if your sons had seasonal moods. Maybe it's less of a deal in Texas than in Boston, but a lot of people will, there's the winter depression, and there's also the late summer manic-y symptoms, or early spring sometimes.
Right, that's a great question. So we do live in the suburbs of New Orleans, very similar. But, what is it? I'm trying to think of, April is the cruelest month. Okay, T.S. Eliot. And people do get manic more statistically, and I think that poets like this, they just have insight. Of course, he wrote all that before we knew about the circadian system. But yes, they did have got worse in the spring, like many people do. And that based on that, at least in part, like there's always many factors, but that I believe was one factor because it was consistent.
Yeah. I had this idea that it was sort of related to our agricultural past, where spring and fall were times where you were intensely busy and had to harvest or whatever. But lately I've noticed that my dogs, every fall, like late summer and fall, as soon as it gets a little cooler, they're frantic. They're just so high energy, and similar thing in the spring. So it's not just humans, it's a biorhythm that many species have.
Yeah, I agree with you. The zoomies, and my cats get the zoomies. Yeah, and I mean it's functional because in the winter we need to sleep in the caves and eat less food because we have less food. Yeah. So I mean it is deeply rooted in biology. Many people, including myself, think, it's we are animals. Yes.
Sometimes my patients will say, "Oh, I hate the holidays. I just feel so awful. My family is like, they're so dysfunctional." And I'm like, "Well, why don't you try a light box and see?" And they'll come back and say, "My family's still dysfunctional, but I wasn't nearly as miserable."
You're convincing me about the light box therapy.
I have an Instructables webpage that tells you how to make one for like $12, because a lot of the commercial ones are way too dim. They're not strong enough. So
they are.
But they just keep you awake. I mean, even if you don't have seasonal mood disorder, it suppresses melatonin secretion and stuff. So stick it next to your computer, and every time you're sleepy, turn it on.
That's that afternoon sleepiness. Instead of have the caffeine, it's better for us, better for me. Yeah, instead of do that second caffeine stuff in the afternoon. That's a great tip.
Oh yeah, now we're going to get all granular about this, but don't drink caffeine because you get that hypersomnolent rebound. It's so addictive, Now, modafinil and armodafinil are the only two stimulants that I know of that don't have habituation. You can take them for years and just stop, and you don't get a rebound.
Which one? So, I didn't hear.
Modafinil and armodafinil.
Yeah, I'll use modafinil occasionally for jet lag because it does have the time travel sleep disorder indication. Yeah. And I find really low doses helpful. If I get too high, I'll get a headache. A lot of people have that. It gives them headaches. But those are great drugs. They have wonderful uses.
I use them like methadone for the heroin of caffeine for my patients with essential tremor, who all say, "Oh, my caffeine doesn't affect my tremor." I'm like, "Yeah, it does. Let's just try." I know you need to like, no one wants to give up that rebound relief, when the caffeine hits, but this helps them just detox off the caffeine.
Yeah, that's wise. That is wise. I haven't read Michael Pollan's book yet about the caffeine.
Did you write? I didn't even know that. I've only read the psychedelic book.
Yeah, he wrote one of his newest book that I haven't read yet, apparently. It's a lot about caffeine, and he calls it the most common drug that we use humans, and I think he's probably right.
I don't know. There's a lot of common drugs, but it's so we probably all remember hating the taste of coffee the first time we drank it. It's gross, right? But how quickly it becomes a releasing stimulus, like like a cocaine addict seeing their freebasing equipment. Now, when I go past a Starbucks, even though I have all sorts of intellectual beliefs about how bad caffeine is, that smell.
The smell's great. Okay, so the way they train us in New Orleans is with the cafe au lait. So my grandmother would give me the coffee milk with sugar with just a little bit of coffee, and then that's how I got started. But
right,
yeah,
it's like good. Purdue Pharma giving away free samples of OxyContin back in the day.
Well, yeah, it was like that. Hopefully, a little less destructive than the opioids they gave. But yeah, that's how kids are usually, especially of my generation. That's how we were started on it. Yeah, that's a nice note. Any wrapping up comments?
I was trying to think if I could tie this discussion of like stimulants and sedatives back to our original topic of empathy, which I probably can't do, but it is interesting to think about how hard all of us try to keep ourselves in the zone where we're exactly as alert as we want or we think we should be, and then our brainstem has a different idea of how alert we should be. And I think that's especially hard for people with mood disorders because they're always getting impulses from their brainstem that are mismatched with what they should be. Like it's telling them to be really agitated when they're just in some boring seminar, and it's telling them to fall asleep when they should be doing something. And so the the tyranny of that aspect of the autonomic nervous system is really life shaping.
Yeah, it's hard. And I think this does circle back to the vagus nerve stimulation.
Yeah.
Okay, because, we, are regulating our our internal environment based on every single thought and everything, right? And so, look, I do the forest bathing to try to calm myself down. I meditate every day, deep breathing. So there are things we can do and that are helpful. But look, that vagus nerve stimulator, I have migraine, so it's rescue, and I'll use it if a patient yells or something, which occasionally happens. I will do it to help myself ratchet down. So it's a nice new addition. But yes, I think it's interesting to think of it as a disorder of, in part, of course not complete, of the autonomic nervous system dysregulation. That's part of it. Yeah.
My first psychiatrist was European, and she used to say in her elegant, disdainful European voice, "You Americans all think of bipolar disorder as being about moods, but it's really about energy. You have high energy states and you have low energy states," and that fit because the happiness and sadness of those spectrum, that was much less relevant than the overwhelming overstimulation of being up and the like absence of anything being down.
Yeah, I love that description, because then that goes to brain energy.
Yeah.
Right? It's a direct, perhaps mitochondrial energy. I don't know. That's going to be, in some of the new studies, I think, and in the brain omics research that I'm very excited about. We won't go there, completely wonderful, different topic. But I think that I feel very hopeful that a lot of this is going to be better understood, and that's a really important way to think about it. And it's going to be fascinating. I am fascinated to see what's going to come out of that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it's just been an utter pleasure to speak with you today.
Yeah.
And I want to thank you so much. And
you too. It's great to talk to a kindred spirit.
Yes, it is. I knew we would be.